Though our top story this hour, and that is North Korea. It is lashing out again. The Hermit Kingdom now threatening to detonate a hydrogen bomb over the Pacific Ocean. This as Kim Jong-un says this, quote, and I'm quoting, "I am now thinking hard about what response he could have expected when he allowed such eccentric words to trip off his tongue. Whatever Trump might have expected, he will face results beyond his expectation." Then President Trump tweeted this. Kim Jong-un of North Korea, who is obviously a madman who doesn't mind starving or killing his people, will be tested like never before. All of this coming after the president, of course, warned this week that the U.S. could, quote, totally destroy North Korea if North Korea forces the U.S. to defend itself. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, echoed the comments. Listen.
We don't want war. That's the last thing anyone wants. We don't want loss of life. That's the last thing anyone wants. But at the same time, we're not going to run scared. If, for any reason, North Korea attacks the United States or our allies, the U.S. will respond, period. That's what's going to happen.
Joining us right now is the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, author of Sea Power, The History of Geopolitics of the World's Oceans, Admiral James Stavridis. Admiral, it's good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Great to be with you, Maria.
Your reaction to the escalating North Korean aggression?
We need some new thinking here. We've got two leaders, both of them relatively inexperienced in their jobs, who are kind of coming at each other like a pair of bulldogs. And we need to get out of this box that is driving us relentlessly toward escalation. So I'll give you three quick ideas. One is using cyber more effectively, offensively against this regime. Number two is upping our defensive game with our missile defense, but also doing some new things to attack these missiles in boost phase when they take off. And thirdly, we need to be thinking about a naval blockade, much as we did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In any event, Maria, we need some new thinking. We're really locked into a bad pattern here.
Admiral, you've suggested this naval blockade, which technically is considered an act of war. Would Kim Jong-un interpret it as such? That's the key here. How hard can we go without inducing a response from that regime? Could he interpret that as a threat to the very nature?
Yeah, you're exactly right. That's the delicate balance. But if you look back at the blockade against Cuba during the missile crisis, we went quite offensive on that, but we ended up, I think, in the right place. Russia opposed it. China didn't have the power to really oppose at that point. That's what we need to worry about, is not so much the North Korean response, but Russia and China. That's why we need to continue the efforts at the United Nations, and I think Nikki Haley's doing a good job there. You need both that soft power diplomacy, but you're going to need some hard power alongside it. A blockade is probably the right next step.
Admiral, you talked, your first point was about cyber. And, you know, we're sitting here talking about Equifax and SEC breaches and, you know, Americans are under duress with these things. Why are we not doing more of that with North Korea? Why is that not a bigger part of how we've been trying to deal with this issue?
I think that is the major question we should be addressing right now, is how we can use cyber offensively in this situation. Now, let's face it. We tend to hold those cards pretty close, and we should. The United States has the best suite of offensive cyber tools of any nation in the world. China, Russia, just below us, few other countries past them. But what we should do is use it directed against their weapons programs, like we did reportedly against the Iranian program some years ago, to undermine confidence. And let's recognize there's an ancillary benefit. North Korea gains a lot of income selling its weapon systems. If we can show them to be less than effective, random failures, that's a good way to go. The ultimate end on cyber is going after the electric grid in North Korea. That affects the population. We don't want to do that unless we have to, but it's another tool in the quiver.
Admiral, it's Dagan McDowell. In terms of the actual capability of North Korea to detonate a hydrogen bomb in the Pacific, do we really know whether they have a fully miniaturized a nuclear device, whether a missile is capable of re-entering, or would they go as far as, which is something someone mentioned, putting a hydrogen bomb on a ship and literally sending it into the Pacific to be detonated?
First, we should recognize that our intelligence is highly imperfect here, and our intelligence community was caught off guard by the size of the probable hydrogen bomb that they just detonated in an underground test. This is a very difficult nation to penetrate in terms of intelligence. I would estimate, and most of the people I would speak with who are looking at intelligence currently would say they do not have the ability to miniaturize and harden, so that air-burst hydrogen bomb seems unlikely. Probably, if they wanted to do something, it would be a detonation from a platform. That would have its own set of intelligence indicators. I wouldn't overly worry about this hydrogen bomb at sea at this point, but they've surprised us before.
Wow, and they're making these incredible threats. I mean, you have to take him at his word, I guess. Let me ask you this. The White House is now 8 months into the new administration, Admiral. Some say that Defense Secretary Jim Mattis seems to be the only top national security official to disagree with the president without actually provoking him. When the president threatened to, quote, destroy North Korea in his speech to the UN this Tuesday, Mattis spoke of a diplomatic resolution. What do you make of this relationship between the president and Secretary Mattis?
I think that Secretary Mattis has three things going for him. Number one, because he's a retired senior military, he gets built-in respect from the president, and I think that's sincere coming from the president. Secondly, Secretary Mattis is kind of in his own little garden over there in the Pentagon. He's not in the day-to-day flow and the domestic political mix, so he's got a little bit of a buffer. And then thirdly, he's running an enormous organization, $600 billion budget, that is highly competent and is delivering wins to the president, example being the hurricane response. So I think as a result, Secretary Mattis, Maria, has a little bit of extra running room, and he uses that to exercise his own independent judgment, which I admire.
Which many people admire. And how would you compare that to Rex Tillerson?
I would say Secretary Tillerson seems to be at the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of the way the president looks at him. I don't see much respect coming from the White House to Secretary Tillerson. I don't see Secretary Tillerson taking a public position on anything. And I would say most of us who are observing diplomacy and our security structure would hope that Secretary Tillerson would step up his game and get more into the flow and be more of a voice in the administration, because he has enormous global credibility. At the moment, we're seeing an imbalance, more from Secretary of Defense, not enough from Secretary of State. We want to get kind of war and peace, diplomacy, and military options in balance.
Yeah,
Maria.
it's interesting that you mentioned that relationship is not as strong in terms of what you see with Mattis, which is one of the reasons that some people were floating Nikki Haley around. Well, there's always Nikki Haley to step into the Secretary of State job, should there be reason to do so. Is that something that you would agree with, Admiral?
I would say that Ambassador Haley is doing a superb job at the United Nations. Let's face it, that is a cabinet-level position, ambassador to the United Nations. She's got probably the weakest hand of cards to play overall, given the criticism from the White House to the United Nations. But she's scoring real wins over there.
She really is.
She's demonstrating enormous competence.
Yeah. Admiral, good to see you.
Great seeing you, Maria.
Admiral
Thanks.
James Stavridis there.